Hey there. Tonight, we are stepping into a winter so cold that a house was not really a house unless it could trick death for one more night. Historians studying medieval homes have compared manor records, excavation layers, smoke stains, hearth remains, roof angles, and even frost damage on surviving timbers. And the picture is quietly astonishing. People did not survive freezing winters because their homes were comfortable in the modern sense. They survived because every wall, every handful of moss, every rush on the floor, every ember hidden under ash, and every sleeping body close to another body became part of a careful defense against the cold. If this kind of slow history helps you rest, gently like the video and subscribe. Now let the room dim a little. Let your breathing lengthen. Let your shoulders loosen. Imagine a village somewhere in northern Europe, the sky pale as old bone, your breath white in the air, the snow packed hard under your boots, and every timber cottage around you holding a very small miracle of heat. I have always found winter history strangely intimate. Wars can be grand. Kings can be loud. But a family trying to keep a room warm through one medieval night feels closer to the skin. It is human at the most immediate level. No speech can persuade frost. No noble title can scare off a draft. If the wall leaks, it leaks. If the fire dies, it dies. If the roof sags under snow, everyone inside understands the problem at once. Down in the body, where fear lives before language reaches it. So let us begin outside, in the darkening lane of a village where the air smells of wood smoke and wet wool. Snow has drifted up against the lower walls of the cottages. The roofs sit low and thick, their thatch carrying a soft white burden. A roaster, poor confused thing, gives one weak call into the gray and then seems to regret the effort. The village is quiet in the way only cold can make it quiet. Even the dogs move carefully. Even the smoke rises slowly, as if it too would rather not disturb the air. You walk toward one small house. The door is thick, rough, heavy in the hand. When it opens, the hinges complain in a low wooden voice, and immediately the smell reaches you. Smoke first, then damp straw, then old timber darkened with soot. Then a sweeter note from something simmering near the coals. Onions, perhaps, or cabbage, or the ghost of salted pork from a better day. The room is dim, but not unfriendly. Embers glow in the hearth, more orange than red. A woman bends near them. A child sleeps under wool. A dog curls into himself so tightly that he seems almost round. In the corner, someone has hung cloaks that have been patched so many times, the original cloth has become more rumor than fabric. This is where the source transcript begins so effectively, because it does not romanticize the room too quickly. It lets the cold stay present. You can feel it at the edges. It presses through the wall. It lingers near the floor. It waits by the little slit of a window. The house is warmer than outside. Yes, but warmth here is local, fragile, negotiated. Near the hearth, the air is gentler. A few steps away, your fingers would still stiffen. Medieval coziness was not the luxury of whole rooms evenly warmed. It was pockets of mercy. and yet those pockets mattered enough to shape entire lives. The walls around you are wattle and daub, a woven skeleton of hazel or willow, mud packed thick with straw, sand if available, animal dung often, because dung has the decency to be useful long after more glamorous substances have failed to show up. Some records even suggest hair worked into mixtures where whatever added strength was welcome. The wall feels uneven under the palm, cool, except where the hearth has slowly pressed some stored warmth into it. There are cracks. Of course there are cracks. Moss has been pushed into them in little strips and wads. Not beautifully, effectively. Or as effectively as a family can manage when weather keeps undoing what hands repair. That phrase matters. Hands repair. Again and again. One of the most revealing details in the source is that medieval people spent astonishing amounts of time mending their own homes. Roof patching, wall repairing, door rehanging, redaubing, resealing. Winter was not a season one, survived by building once and then admiring the result. A house was more like a living companion that constantly needed attention. If you neglected it, the cold would notice before you did. Honestly, I think that may be one reason these houses feel so human to us now. They were not finished objects. They breathed, leaked, sagged, dried, swelled, cracked, and endured. A beam above the doorway is smooth, where hands have touched it for years, maybe generations. Smoke has blackened it almost to the color of memory. You run your fingers along the grain and feel the polish left by oil from living skin. The house has been held together by material and by touch. Outside, other cottages huddle close. That is not sentiment. It is strategy. Shared walls lose less heat. Lanes narrow because wind is rude, and villages learn. In some colder regions, people dug homes partly into the ground so the earth itself could steady the temperature. Earth is rarely cozy in poetry, but it is wonderfully practical in winter. Dig into a slope and the world becomes quieter. Air stills. The temperature stops behaving like a spoiled noble and becomes more predictable. The source mentions this with a nice little spark of surprise, because modern people tend to imagine cozy as bright and airy, when in severe winter, cozy often means low, thick, tucked in, almost hidden. The Vikings understood that well. Their long houses with turf roofs must have felt to later visitors like green beasts asleep under snow. You step into one in the mind and feel the change immediately. The smell turns earthy, moist, smoky, alive. The roof above is less a lid than a blanket. The ground itself helps hold back the cold. It is not elegant in the polished, courtly sense, but survival is often more intelligent than elegance. Back in the village cottage, the sounds are small and steady. A spoon against a pot. A child shifting in sleep. A dogtail thumping once on the floor. The slow sigh of wind through some gap no moss has fully defeated. The source is very good on this point too. Medieval coziness was sound as much as heat. The house did not keep winter out completely. It made winter distant enough that human sound could matter more. You move toward the hearth. It sits in the room like a tired heart, still determined to beat. Stones around it are blackened. A little ash shifts as a log settles. The heat on your face is immediate, almost startling, while your back still knows the room is cold. This unevenness shaped behavior. People crouched low, sat near, gathered close. Warmth encouraged nearness because warmth itself lived in nearness. Family life was architectural before it was emotional. People clustered because they had to. Over time, that need becomes tenderness. A child sleeping near a cradle close to the fire is not only practical, it becomes what safety feels like. And so the source gives us the central truth early, and it is a lovely one. Coziness in the medieval winter was built from closeness. Low ceilings, tight rooms, heavy cloth, shared heat, animal bodies nearby, even smoke, which modern people hate with perfect confidence, had its role. It stained lungs, yes. Irritated eyes, certainly. But it also gathered near the rafters, slowed movement of air, drove pests away, dried timber, and, in a slightly perverse way, made the room feel inhabited. A house without soot was not admirable. It was suspiciously cold. There is something almost funny in that, if you allow it. Today we open windows to feel fresh and virtuous. In a hard winter cottage, fresh air could behave like a minor villain. Better a little stale smoke than a clean draft with murderous intent. You sit now on a low stool or perhaps only crouch by the fire, because medieval furniture is often less abundant in imagination than in museums. The floor beneath you is packed earth, swept and pressed smooth by many feet. Rushes have been laid over parts of it. They soften the ground, absorb damp, add one more weak but useful layer between skin and frozen soil. If herbs have been mixed in, lavender perhaps, or sweet flag, their scent rises only faintly beneath the smoke, but it rises. Even here, beauty finds a way to hide in utility. That may be the deepest charm of the whole subject. Nothing is wasted. Warm stones under blankets, ale heated at the edge of the coals, a wool cloak so patched it resembles a family argument stitched together over 20 years. Every object is trying to be two things at once, useful and comforting. Survival and softness become partners. Night deepens. The room narrows around the hearth light. Outside, the world is white and gray and full of the possibility of wolves, storms, drifting snow, and bad luck. Inside, the shadows flicker on the wall, and every face near the fire seems gentler than it would in daylight. This is not luxury. It is harder and more precious than luxury. Luxury can be wasted. Warmth like this cannot. It must be built, protected, coaxed, fed, and shared. One old survey quoted in the source says, peasants might spend nearly half the year repairing their homes. I believe it. Looking around this room, you feel maintenance everywhere. The wall has been reworked, the roof patched, the door mended, the floor relayed. Every repair is a sentence in the long conversation between people in winter. Every repair says, not this year, not tonight. You will not take us tonight. And perhaps that is why these dim little rooms still affect us. They reveal something modern comfort tries to hide. Warmth is not ordinary. It is made. It is preserved by skill, repetition, and care. The family near the hearth knows that in their bones. The dog knows it. The house itself knows it in every beam that swells and shrinks and waits for another season of smoke. Stay there a moment longer. Watch the ember brighten when stirred. Notice how the cold presses at the edges but does not quite win. Listen to the tiny domestic sounds becoming louder than the weather. Feel how the room holds life together, not with abundance, but with stubbornness and design. In the next movement, we step outside again and begin looking closely at what these homes were actually made from. Timber, daub, stone, earth, roof, rush, and all the rough, intelligent material choices that turned landscapes into shelter. Morning in winter never feels entirely like morning here. The light arrives pale and tired, as though it too spent the night near the hearth and did not rest especially well. Frost feathers the edge of the window covering. The room exhales cold from every surface the fire could not fully persuade. You rise from the stool or the bed or the patch of warmth you claimed, and immediately the body understands the next lesson. In a medieval winter house, comfort starts long before blankets and embers. It starts in the structure itself. The source moves into materials here, and it is one of my favorite parts, because the village begins to look less like scenery and more like thought made visible. Step outside into the lane, and every house around you reveals an argument with climate. Timber frames dark with age. Wattle panels bulging slightly behind plaster. Roofs pitched low and thick with thatch. Stone foundations crouched near the earth. Nothing has been built to impress a passing king. Everything has been built to discourage cold. Wood is the skeleton of most houses. Not abstract wood, but particular trees from particular places. Oak if fortune and landscape allow. Dense and patient and strong enough to outlast generations if smoke and weather are kind. Pine and birch where oak is scarce. Driftwood in poorer places or river regions where a storm might do part of the labor for you if you are lucky and shameless enough to claim it. Reused beams from older structures. Planks pried free. Trimmed. Planed again. Given a second life. Because timber takes years to grow, and a winter house cannot wait for moral purity. Imagine the labor of it slowly. An iron axe biting into frozen bark. The knock of metal through wood on a morning when breath hangs in the air. Men or women or whoever is available hauling the trunk by oxen or sled. The scrape over frozen mud. The beam laid down near a half-built frame. Then the shaping. Adze strokes. Plain marks. Chips falling. A beam is not only a beam. It is time condensed. Tree years turned into survival. I have always liked the honesty of old timber. It remembers that it was once alive. Even squared off for a wall, the grain still moves under the hand. You can feel the ridges where tools passed. No machine regularity. No smooth modern arrogance. Just handwork. A little uneven. A little stubborn. And all the stronger for it. The source mentions that many beams were joined with wooden pegs rather than nails because metal was expensive. And there is such quiet brilliance in that. Use wood to hold wood. Let the house trust its own material. Of course, the frame alone means very little in winter. A skeleton does not stop wind. Between the timbers comes the woven work. Wattle, the thin branches of hazel or willow bent and threaded together until a panel appears. It looks modest, even flimsy, until the daub arrives. Mud, straw, sand when possible, dung very often, because dung has the decency to be useful long after more glamorous substances have failed to show up. In some households, perhaps even hair from combs, because waste is a modern luxury and medieval winters punish sentimentality about scraps. The mixture is slapped and pressed onto the woven wall by hand. Imagine the feel of that. Wet, cold, grainy, fibrous, earthy, heavy in the palm. It smells of field and stable and rain and animal and soil, which is to say, it smells of the world the house must defend you from and also borrow from at the same time. Once dry, the wall hardens surprisingly well. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. But enough. Enough is often the great medieval standard. Enough to keep out the worst. Enough to make the fire worth lighting. You press a hand to such a wall and it feels cool. Perhaps a little crumbly at the edge. Perhaps repaired with fresher material in a patch where last winter won a small argument. That patchiness is important. These houses are not monuments. They are in conversation with weather. A good wall is not one that never cracks. A good wall is one people know how to mend before the crack becomes a draft and the draft becomes a threat. The roof above matters just as much. Thatch is one of those things modern people tend to romanticize because they see it in postcards and not during sleet. But thick thatch is serious engineering in a quiet rural disguise. Straw, reed, heather, whatever the region offers, layered densely enough that water runs off rather than through, and air pockets hold warmth the way a blanket does. The source notes that in summer such roofs kept out heat, and in winter trapped what little warmth the house could manage. And that is exactly the beauty of natural material used well. It is not specialized for one season. It listens to the whole year. Stand under the eaves and look up. The thatch is golden where fresh, silvering where weather has chewed it, darker where smoke has kissed it from within. Birds may nest in it, because birds are freeloaders in every century. A hen might even roost there if she feels superior enough. But its real work is humble and constant. It sheds snow. It breaks rain. It slows wind. It softens sound. When the roof settles under weight, you hear it as a tiny creak in the room below and know the house is still doing its job. There is a long-running debate. The source mentions it, about whether thatched roofs were truly as dangerously flammable as legend claims. I suspect the answer is annoyingly practical. Sometimes yes, sometimes less so. A damp roof in a wet region behaves differently from a dry, neglected one beside an eager chimney. Medieval life is often like that. One romantic generalization collapses under the dull force of local conditions. Then there is the ground. A modern person can forgive many things in a room if the floor is warm. Medieval floors were rarely warm in any flattering sense. Packed earth is common, flattened by countless steps, perhaps strewn with rushes, perhaps perfumed a little if herbs are available, Perhaps not. You kneel and touch it. Smooth from use. Hard in places. Damp at the edges. The source wisely resists mocking this. An earth floor is not a failure. It is a material answer. The earth is there. The family is there. The question becomes not what would be ideal, but what can be made livable. Rushes help. Straw helps. Herbs help a little with smell, and perhaps morale. People criticize such floors now because they imagine cleanliness as a moral duty rather than a moving target. But a rush-covered floor in winter does several things at once. It softens the tread, absorbs some damp, adds one more insulating layer, gives the room a scent that is not only mud and smoke. Even a little lavender or mint among the rushes is an act of resistance. One could almost call it medieval optimism underfoot. In regions with more stone than wood, walls and foundations shift accordingly. Run your fingers over a stone house wall, and it feels older than speech. Rough blocks, guarse mortar, lime, and grit. Sometimes odd strengthening mixtures the source mentions, even blood in some traditions, because people will stir nearly anything into a wall if someone older swears by it. Stone has its own cold dignity. It lasts. It also steals warmth from the hand so quickly that wealth and comfort part ways. A grand stone house can impress the eye while punishing the bare foot. Medieval people knew that too. Status did not always buy softness. That is why partly sunken houses are so clever. Dig into a slope or lower the floor into the earth and suddenly the world changes. The doorway becomes a little den-like. The air stills. The scent of soil and smoke thickens. A dog in the corner barely bothers to look at you because he has understood the advantage of the place faster than any philosopher. The source calls such houses perhaps the poorest or the cleverest, depending on perspective. And that is exactly right. Poverty and ingenuity often share a wall. Each region solves the same winter in its own accent. Northern houses lean toward thick walls, low ceilings, and small openings. Mediterranean houses, where the cold behaves differently, may open more to air and courtyard life. Even within one village, no two homes entirely agree. One roof leaks less. One doorway hangs straighter. One family swears by moss between beams. Another insists clay-rich daub lasts longer. Medieval architecture at this level is not doctrine. It is rumor turned tradition. Someone tried a thing. It worked. Their children copied it. That is how civilizations survive more often than they like to admit. You wander now through the village and begin to feel admiration replacing pity. These people were not living in crude huts because they lacked imagination. They were building with intense local intelligence. Every wall is a solved problem. Every roof angle is remembered weather. Every foundation tells you where water once pooled and how later builders learned not to be fooled by the same patch of ground again. The source puts this beautifully when it says, there are no architects here, only craftsmen and necessity. I might add one more thing, and memory. Memory is all over these houses. Look at the pile of logs stacked against a wall, each one cut, dried, hoarded, respected. Fuel is architecture too. Really. though we tend to notice it later because it burns away. Without those logs, the walls are merely an argument. With them, the house becomes a promise. Notice also how houses huddle, shoulder to shoulder. It looks almost affectionate from a distance, but like many affectionate things, it began as strategy. Shared walls hold heat. Narrow spacing breaks wind. The village itself becomes an insulating device. There is a lesson in that which medieval people probably never felt the need to phrase. Survival is easier in clusters. The source mentions that traces of pigment suggest some walls may once have been brighter than our modern drab imagination allows. I like that detail very much. Imagine ochre wash or pale red against snow. A village not only brown and gray, but touched with color. It reminds us that hard lives do not eliminate beauty. They make beauty tactical. A bright wall against winter can be morale wearing plaster. By evening, the village steams faintly where heat meets frost. Smoke rises from several roofs and drifts upward in thin lines before dissolving. From afar, the cottages look fragile. Up close, they feel stubborn. That may be the best word for medieval domestic architecture in winter. Stubborn. Not perfect. Not clean-lined. Not unified by theoretical elegance. Simply determined. Stay in that determination a little longer. Run a hand over rough timber. Smell the daub drying where a patch was made. Hear straw shifting on a roof under the weight of snow. Notice the little stone foundation trying its best against damp earth. Feel how every surface carries both weakness and intelligence. These homes were never built to outshine the season, only to outlast it. And in the next part, we move closer still, into the hidden logic beneath and above. Foundations, roof lines, floors, and ceilings. Because warmth in a medieval winter was never only a matter of lighting a fire. It was a whole architecture of small defenses, each one almost modest on its own, and together just strong enough to keep a family alive. By the time you have stood in the lane and traced the walls with your eyes, the next truth begins to show itself. A medieval winter house did not survive because it had one grand secret. It survived because of 100 small decisions, each one almost humble, each one working quietly with the others. The source turns here toward foundations, roofs, ceilings, floors, and all the hidden choices that helped a room keep hold of life while the season tried to take it away. Let us begin at the lowest point, because winter usually does. It works upward from the ground. Cold enters through the feet before it ever reaches philosophy. A house needed some kind of foundation, even if only a modest one, because wet earth is patient and cruel. It softens timber, shifts walls, and turns warmth into damp misery. So people laid stone where they could. Nothing grand, nothing symmetrical in the cathedral sense. A row of rough rocks, a shallow trench, packed rubble, chalk in one region, fieldstone in another, just enough to lift the timber frame a little above the wet breath of the soil. If you kneel by such a foundation in the mind and touch it, the sensation is immediate. The stone is cold, but it is an organized cold, a useful cold. The sort that says the builder knew water would gather here if given half a chance. I have always liked foundations for that reason. They are silent evidence of practical pessimism. Someone expected trouble and laid stone accordingly. The source points out that many medieval people did not have formal plans in the modern sense. No rolled blueprints. No architect with a sharpened charcoal pencil and a disapproving expression. What they had was observation. They knew where rain ran after a storm. They knew which patch of ground held water too long. They knew where frost sat deepest at dawn. They knew which side of a hill spared a wall from the worst of the wind. That knowledge became the foundation as surely as the stone itself. Above the stones rose the timber and daub, and above that the roof, which may be the true hero of winter architecture. Roof pitch was not an aesthetic whim. It was weather translated into angle. Too shallow and snow would linger like a sullen guest. Too steep and materials became harder to manage, heavier to repair, more vulnerable to violent wind. So villages learned their slopes by living under them. A good roof line was simply remembered weather made visible. Imagine a steep white roof after a night of snow. The weight lies across the thatch like folded wool. A little melt begins at the edges where smoke and faint trapped heat have done their patient work. Then a low slide. Not a dramatic avalanche, just a soft settling whisper as the roof shrugs off what it can. Someone inside hears that sound and feels relief without necessarily naming it. The house is still carrying them. Thatch had to be held in place too. Pegs, twine, stakes, sometimes stones, sometimes cross pieces. Every region had its little tricks and arguments. One family might swear by tighter bundles, another by a deeper pitch, another by replacing a weather-beaten section every autumn before the serious cold arrived. The source is very good on this point. Medieval building was not one uniform system. It was a long conversation in local dialects between people and climate. Then there is the ceiling, or what passes for one. In many modest cottages, the ceiling is not a separate, elegant plane at all. It is the underside of the roof, darkened by years of smoke, until the beams look almost varnished by soot. Bowed rafters, rough laths, shadows resting in every angle. When you look up, the whole house seems to lean over you slightly, not in menace, but in tired protection. I find that image strangely comforting. A smoke-blackened ceiling tells you at once that the hearth has lived here for years. Smoke has risen night after night, winter after winter, and left its history overhead. It is dirty. Yes, it stings eyes. It clings to cloth, but it is also proof that the house has remained inhabited. Soot is the handwriting of endurance. The source notes that smoke sometimes escaped through a simple opening, a louver, or whatever gap the builders could coax into usefulness. That sounds primitive, only to people who have never had to choose between clear air and lost heat. Better a smoky room than a dead fire. Better stinging eyes than blue fingers. Medieval life often asks the body to negotiate rather than insist. Let us come back down to the floor, because a floor in winter is more important than modern comfort tends to remember. Packed earth could be swept, tamped, renewed. In some places, wooden planks improved matters, though wood floors had their own complaints and their own opportunities to let drafts rise from below. In wealthier homes, Stone or tile might appear, handsome in theory and freezing in practice. The source wisely mentions that stone floors could be beautiful but brutally cold, and I appreciate that little honesty. Wealth loves appearance. Winter prefers kindness. Rushes laid across the ground did more than soften a room. They trapped a little air. They caught dirt. They made damp less immediate. Sometimes sweet herbs were scattered with them. Mint, lavender, meadowsweet, sweet flag. Not enough to transform the room into a summer meadow, but enough to interrupt the rule of smoke and wet wool with something gentler. You know that feeling when a room has one note of fragrance that makes you forgive all the others. Medieval people understood that perfectly well. If you walk slowly across such a floor, you hear the little whisper of dry plant matter under the sole. Not silence. Never silence. Houses like these are full of low sounds. Rushes shifting. Boards answering weight with a soft complaint. Ash settling in the hearth. Wind touching the roof and then moving on when it fails to gain entry. Sound becomes part of warmth because sound proves the house is active, inhabited, resisting. The source also mentions sloping floors and practical unevenness, which I adore because it reminds us that comfort does not require perfection. A slight slope helps water drain. A raised lip at the doorway slows the inward crawl of mud and melt. A worn threshold tells you where the traffic of years has passed. Medieval homes were not built to satisfy an inspector. They were built to answer recurring trouble. In some regions, cellars or underfloor spaces deepened the logic of the house. Not every peasant cottage had one, of course. But where possible, a cellar meant storage, and storage meant security. Roots, turnips, cane, grain, salted meat if fortune had smiled recently. All of these could live in the cool dark below. And the house above gained another layer of insulation, almost by accident. A hollow beneath the floor is not warm in itself, but it changes the conversation between room and earth. It gives the living space one more little buffer against the season. Step down into such a cellar in your mind. The air grows stiller, colder in a different way. Not the knife of wind, but the patient chill of ground that remembers summer only faintly. The smell is earth and storage and old wood. Barrels breathing quietly. A sack tied shut. Perhaps a mouse that considers the whole arrangement partly its own. Then you climb back into the room above and feel, with an almost guilty pleasure, that it is warmer there than below. The contrast teaches gratitude. Another detail from the source stays with me. Houses leaned, settled, twisted a little over time. Repairs were constant. No one expected a home to remain in perfect alignment forever. Frost heaves. Wet years swell wood. Dry years crack daub. Roof loads test joints. Smoke dries one beam while damp punishes another. The house is always aging. But because it is always aging, it is always being known. A family understands its own building the way one understands an older relative, where it complains in wind, where it drips after thaw, where the door sticks in wet weather, where the draft returns each year no matter how much moss you stuff into the seam. I think that is why medieval domestic life feels so intimate. People did not simply live in houses. They tended relationships with them. Roof mending in autumn, wall patching in spring, floor relaying when the rushes had grown too sour or too dirty, beam bracing when the sag became impossible to ignore. Every season touched the house and asked something of its occupants in return. There is even a little humor hidden in all this. Medieval people would probably laugh, gently, but with some justice, at the modern fantasy that a home should be flawless. A flawless home would be suspicious. Has no child ever slammed that door? Has no dog leaned there? Has no snow settled on that roof? Has no smoke kissed those beams? A house that has kept people alive through winter ought to look as though it has done some work. And the work continues overhead and underfoot while daily life moves inside it. A woman sweeps, rushes toward the door. A man taps frost from a boot. A child drags fingers over a blackened beam and gets scolded with no real anger. Someone descends to the cellar with a candle stub. Someone checks the roof after sleet. Someone presses fresh daub into a crack while the weather is kind enough to allow it. None of this is dramatic. That is exactly why it matters. Winter survival is made of undramatic intelligence, repeated faithfully. The source presents medieval building as something learned by doing, and I think that is the most respectful way to see it. These people were not ignorant of comfort. They were experts in a harsher version of it. They knew how to lower a roof enough that heat lingered near bodies. They knew how to angle a wall against prevailing wind. They knew how much earth, straw, moss, raid, wood, and labor a family could spare before the season turned. They built from limit, and from that limit, they carved out a life. Stay in the room now and look upward once more. Soot-black beams, a little smoke moving under the roof, then down again to the floor. Rushes, packed earth, a faint herbal note under heavier scents. Out toward the wall, daub repaired in patches, moss in a crack, a foundation of rough stone doing its quiet duty. The house is not elegant in the courtly sense. It is elegant in the winter sense. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary, every surface answering cold. And now, with the walls understood from bottom to top, we can move toward the center that made all of it worth the labor. The hearth, the living mouth of the house, the place where stone, smoke, timber, food, story, prayer, and warmth gathered into one trembling circle of light. If the house was the body of winter's survival, then the hearth was its heart. Everything in the room bent toward it in one way or another. Eyes bent toward it. Hands bent toward it. Hunger bent toward it. Prayer bent toward it. The source lingers here, and rightly so, because no feature of medieval domestic life held more power, more danger, more tenderness, or more practical importance than the fire at the center of the room. Even now, in a modern room with safe walls and easy switches, and the smug convenience of thermostats, a fire changes the atmosphere almost unfairly. It claims attention without asking permission. In a medieval house, that power was greater because the hearth was not decoration. It was the difference between a home and a shelter, between supper and hunger, between dry linen and damp misery, between one more night lived and one more night endured badly. Picture it slowly. At first there is only the glow under ash, banked from the night before. Someone kneels, fingers with little feeling in them yet, a breath given carefully. Then another, a twig laid across the quiet red. One ember brightens, another answers. A pale thread of smoke lifts. Then the smallest crackle. If you have ever coaxed a reluctant fire back into speech, you know the feeling. Relief begins before flame fully appears. The source describes this daily revival beautifully because it was almost a ritual of hope. If the embers lived, the day could begin. I have always thought banking coals under ash was one of the great quiet arts of old life. It required patience, experience, and a certain faith in hidden warmth. Too little ash, and the fire wastes itself. Too much, and it suffocates. Done properly, heat sleeps and wakes again. What a wonderful metaphor for winter endurance that is. Not brilliance, continuity. As the flame grows, the whole room changes by degrees. Shadows retreat from the floor first. Then the lower wall catches orange. Then the beam above acquires a warm edge, while still holding darkness in its grain. A kettle hung near the fire begins to answer with the faintest tremor. Damp wool set nearby gives off its old smell. A dog lifts its head and decides life is acceptable for another hour. The room has not become warm everywhere. That is important to remember. Medieval fire rarely conquered a whole space in the even modern way. It made a center. Around that center, life arranged itself. That arrangement shaped people physically. The source notes that most ordinary homes gathered around an open hearth set low in the room. No neat cast iron stove. No polite chimney in many earlier or poorer dwellings. Smoke rose and spread and found its reluctant path out through roof openings, through a louver, through any gap generous enough to cooperate. This meant the fire heated, cooked, illuminated, dried, preserved, and suffocated a little all at once. It was never simple. The hearth gave with one hand and took with the other. Yet I cannot help admiring how medieval families made peace with that bargain. Children grew up learning which side of the room stung the eyes least. Adults knew how to move pots through smoke. A grandmother might sit exactly where the warmth reached her knees, while the worst of the reek passed overhead. Someone always knew which cloak could be dried close to the flame, and which would scorch if treated with too much optimism. That kind of knowledge does not come from books. It comes from living long enough beside danger to treat it almost as kin. The hearth was also the kitchen in the deepest sense. Pottage simmered there. Bread dough waited near it. Fat hissed there. Broth thickened there. Onions softened slowly. Ale warmed. Herbs dried. Meat smoked in the higher dark, where the rafters and smoke did their patient work together. If you stand close enough, you can smell all of it layered one over another. Ash, iron, steam, wet wool, old cabbage, rendered fat, wood, resin, and beneath them a sweetness from bread, if fortune has smiled. The source understands that warmth is smell as much as temperature, and that is exactly right. A house begins to feel safe when its smells repeat. You know that feeling when you return somewhere after years and a single scent does more work than memory. The medieval hearth did that daily. It taught the body what safety smelled like. Not perfume. Not cleanliness in our modern, brittle sense. Safety smelled like smoke in cloth, broth in a pot, and embers still alive at dawn. There is a small tenderness in how the source describes fire as social gravity. People sat where the heat allowed. That is so obvious, and yet it changes everything. A mother sewing near the glow. A child nodding toward sleep while still pretending to listen to a story. Someone mending a tool. Someone rubbing hands. Someone holding boots close enough to dry, not close enough to ruin. The circle around the fire became a map of relationships. Nearness had hierarchy. Nearness had affection. Nearness had age and privilege and habit. The best place by the fire was a tiny kingdom. In richer homes, later on, wall fireplaces and better chimneys changed the pattern somewhat. Smoke lifted higher. Rooms could grow clearer. Stone surrounds became more formal. Heat could be directed differently. But the emotional truth stayed the same. Fire remained the living center. Even in castles, for all their grandeur, winter could be a miserable intruder. Great halls were drafty beasts. Tapestries helped. Braziers helped. Fireplaces helped. Yet a castle without active hearths was still only a cold story carved in stone. Wealth improved the technology. It did not abolish the season. Back in the smaller village room, the hearth does more than heat and cook. It receives prayer. The source touches that gently, and I am glad. A fire at the center of the house naturally becomes spiritual, whether doctrine orders it or not. Hands are warmed over it before meals. A blessing is spoken nearby. Ash may mark a little sign. A candle from church might lend its flame to the domestic fire at some holy season, bringing one sacred light into another. The line between practical and sacred grows thin in winter. Anything that keeps children alive acquires reverence. There is humor, too, because the fire is never wholly obedient. Sparks leap where they should not. Smoke sometimes chooses the room over the roof with all the malice of a cat ignoring its name. Pots boil over. A log collapses and startles everyone. An old man swears softly because a sleeve came too near the flame. Survival with fire is intimate enough that irritation and gratitude become twins. The source also mentions drying. That matters more than modern people usually realize. Winter is not only cold, it is damp. A damp garment can make misery multiply. So cloaks are hung near the fire. Boots are turned. Gloves, if such luxuries exist, are spread. Herbs for remedies or scent are tied in bunches above the smoke. Strips of meat harden slowly. Fish cures. Linen steams a little. The hearth is a weather machine. It takes what the outside has made wet and slowly persuades it back toward usefulness. At night, the fire changes character again. The bright, useful day flame gives way to lower glow. Talk softens. Tools are put aside. The pot is moved or covered. The dog settles more firmly. Someone stirs the coals with a stick and watches sparks rise. This may be my favorite hour in the whole medieval room. Work is not over exactly, because work in such a house never quite ends. But the pressure changes. The fire becomes narrative. Storytelling loves low light. So does confession. So does memory. The source understands this and lets the hearth become the place where the day is turned into meaning before sleep takes it. I think that is one reason we still speak of hearth and home in the same breath, as though they were one creature. For centuries they almost were. Remove the hearth, and the home becomes a container. Light the hearth, and the container becomes a world. And yet the world remains fragile. Wood must be rationed. Fuel watched. Ash managed. Too much flame is as dangerous as too little. Children must be taught. Sleeves tucked. Sparks feared. A roof too dry can betray the room in one ugly instant. There is no sentimental fire here. Only respected fire. That respect gives the whole domestic scene a quiet gravity I find deeply moving. Everyone knows the flame is beautiful because it is dangerous and necessary at once. If you stand close now in imagination, you hear the little sounds that make the scene real. A kettle lid ticking. Fat from a pot making a soft spit. Someone drawing in breath through the nose to judge whether the broth needs more time. A spoon on clay. A log settling. A child whispering one last question before being told gently that enough words have been spent for tonight. Even the silence near the fire is active. It has texture. The source says that in some homes people carried warming pans to the bed. Metal or earthen containers heated by the hearth and slipped under blankets to blunt the first cruelty of cold sheets. I adore that detail because it is such a perfect example of medieval intelligence. Heat is portable if you are clever and careful. Warmth need not remain where the flames are. It can be borrowed, carried, stretched. That may be the true lesson of the hearth. Warmth itself can be extended by knowledge. A log becomes coals. Coals become cooked food. Cooked food becomes strength. Strength becomes labor. Labor repairs walls. Walls hold more heat. Heat dries clothes. Dry clothes protect bodies. Bodies sleep closer. Breath warms blankets. The whole house becomes a system organized around one burning center. Nothing is isolated. Everything answers everything else. Stay by the fire now and let the room grow very small and very safe. The wall beyond the light can remain in shadow. The wind can murmur outside without being admitted. The smoke can curl upward in its old imperfect path. A hand can stretch toward the blaze and feel the skin wake. Another hand can turn a loaf. Another can bank a coal for morning. This is not abundance. It is mastery of enough. And in the next movement, we will follow that warmth out into the smaller details that helped keep it from escaping. Moss in cracks, shutters, two-horn windows, cloth barriers, low ceilings, all the subtle acts of insulation and trapped air that allowed one hard-won fire to mean more than a single bright patch in a cold room. Once the hearth has been understood as the heart of the house, the next truth arrives almost by itself. A fire is only as generous as the room allows it to be. Heat wants to climb. Wind wants to enter. Night wants to undo all the patient labor of the day. So medieval people learned another quiet art, the art of keeping warmth near the body after it had been won. The source turns here toward insulation in the widest sense, and I think it may be one of the most underrated forms of intelligence in the whole medieval world. I have always found insulation strangely intimate. A roof beam impresses from across a room. A wall seam full of moss only matters when you live with it. It is the knowledge of fingers, not of monuments. Someone had to notice exactly where the cold came in. Someone had to feel it first with skin before naming it with thought. A little draft on the neck. A colder patch by the bench. A flutter at the edge of the shutter. Those tiny discomforts were not trivial. In winter, they were warnings. So a house began defending itself in layers. Moss was pushed into cracks between timbers. Straw was packed into hollows. Clay daub was smeared fresh over old weak places. Cloths were hung against inner walls. Sometimes, woven reed mats served as an extra skin between people and the chill of stone or daub. Dung mixed with clay held its own humble authority because it sealed, hardened, and filled. Medieval people would have found our modern squeamishness almost comic. If a substance made a wall less murderous in January, it had earned respect. Imagine a woman standing on a low stool with a handful of fresh daub on a gray afternoon. Her fingers are cold, though the mixture itself is colder. She presses it into a crack beside a beam where the wind has learned a familiar route. The wall accepts it. She smooths the surface with the side of her hand. It smells of earth, straw, stable, perhaps a little sour, but also of usefulness. Later, the patch will dry and fade into the rest of the wall. No one will praise it. Yet when darkness comes and the room holds heat a little longer, the patch will have done its work. That is the emotional world of medieval insulation. Little acts that vanish into success. The source also lingers over windows, and rightly so, because windows in winter are not only openings for light, they are negotiations with suffering. Glass existed, yes, especially in richer settings and ecclesiastical ones, but broad, bright panes belong to a much later fantasy of domestic ease. Most ordinary households lived with something else. Tiny windows, shutters, oiled cloth stretched over a frame, parchment, thin horn, scraped and fitted so daylight entered as a glow rather than a view. Horn windows always catch my imagination. Light passing through horn is not clear. It is milky, amber, patient, almost candle-like, even at noon. The outside world becomes suggestion. Snow is only brightness. A tree is a blur. A moving figure is a shadow, but the cold stays out more effectively than it would through an open slit, and that is what matters. Modern people assume that clarity is kindness. Medieval winter architecture knew that mercy is often opaque. When evening fell, shutters changed everything. A wooden panel swung in place. A latch dropped. Sometimes a rag was stuffed into the edge. Sometimes straw. Sometimes a folded scrap of wool that had already served 3 other lives before being promoted to draft soldier. The room changed at once. The source is very good on this. One hears less of the outside. One feels less of it too. The line between house and winter becomes thicker, not fixed. Thicker. Again, that smallness matters. Medieval comfort lives in the almost. You know that feeling when a single cold stream of air stops and your shoulders relax before you even realize why. That is what a good shutter could do. Low ceilings helped too. They kept warmth where warmth was wanted, near people, not hovering uselessly in some noble empty space above. A modern room can afford height because heat is now made to obey by hidden systems and paid bills. A medieval room could not. It asked more practical questions. How little air must we warm? How close can the roof sit without becoming intolerable? How can beds, benches, lofts, and hanging storage all share the same envelope of trapped heat? There is something wonderfully honest in that kind of design. No flattery, just survival thinking made domestic. The source also returns to floors here, which I appreciate because a floor can ruin a room as quickly as a bad wall. Rushes were renewed, straw scattered, matting laid down, sometimes skins, sometimes woven textiles where wealth allowed, not simply for softness, though softness was no small mercy, but because every layer between foot and ground was a layer between blood and frost. Medieval people understood trapped air physically long before anyone cared to describe it in scientific language. Thick thatch above, stuffed wall seams at the side, layered rushes below. The body suspended inside a little pocket of negotiated climate. And then there are the smaller tricks, the ones no grand history lecture tends to honor. A chest pushed against the coldest wall. A hanging garment left near the doorway because even a cloak can break a draft. A bed tucked into the warmest corner rather than the most symmetrical one. A curtain across a sleeping nook. A cradle kept within the hearth radius. A stool moved a little left because that is where the warmth lingers best after midnight. None of these acts alone creates comfort. Together they create the possibility of sleep. I think that is why medieval people were often such acute readers of interior space. They had to be. The source treats this less as explicit theory and more as inherited bodily wisdom, which feels exactly right. People learned with their skin. The body knew the best place on the bench. The body knew which wall leached warmth and which held it. The body knew where steam rose from drying cloth and where smoke gathered too thick to tolerate. A winter house teaches its inhabitants by repeated consequence. There is humor hidden in that too. One imagines some old villager scoffing gently at a younger relative who sits in the wrong corner and then complains of cold. Of course, that corner is cold. It has always been cold. Why else is the storage chest there? Medieval interiors must have been full of such small inherited certainties. Part architecture, part family lore. The source also mentions that smell is part of insulation in a strange, indirect way. A sealed room smells more intensely of itself. Smoke, wool, dried herbs, breath, stew, old wood, beeswax, leather. We tend to think of smell as a consequence, but it is also a sign. The room is holding what is inside. A house that keeps its scent keeps some of its heat. The very thickness of the air becomes a comfort, though not an elegant one. At dusk, when the last bit of gray daylight presses weakly through horn or cloth, the whole system reveals itself. The wall hangings absorb shadows. The shutter blocks the worst draft. Moss in the beam cracks has done its quiet work. The low ceiling keeps the fire's kindness from rising beyond use. The floor layers soften the old cruelty of the ground. The room is still poor by any modern measure. It is still dim, still smoky, still marked by labor in every surface. And yet, it is working. It is holding. It is becoming a little island of survivable air. Honestly, that may be the deepest lesson in this whole medieval winter world. Comfort was not a luxury added after necessity. Comfort was necessity, assembled patiently from rough material and closer attention than many modern people ever have to give their walls. Warmth was not a default. It was a craft. Let the room settle deeper around you. The shutter is closed now, and the little horn pane or oiled cloth no longer has to argue with daylight. Candlelight and firelight take over. Their range is short, but their kindness is exact. They touch the hanging cloth on the wall and make it seem softer than it is. They touch the chest by the outer wall and reveal why it was set there, not by accident, but to blunt cold from that side. They touch the straw at the threshold, where old pieces have been wedged low to keep the underdoor draft from slipping in like a thief. This is what I mean by medieval thermal wisdom. The room is arranged the way water arranges a stream bed. By repeated contact with the force, it must answer. Put a bench in the wrong place for one winter and the body remembers. Put the cradle too near the draft and the child coughs. Leave the shutter edge unstuffed, and everyone notices by midnight. Very little in such a house remains theoretical for long. The source also changes perception of value. A torn cloak was not just a torn cloak. It might become a wall hanging, a curtain, a draft stop, a bed edge stuffing, a wrap for a warming stone, then finally a rag for ash or grease. The life of a textile did not end when fashion or dignity gave out. It descended, level by level, into deeper usefulness. I suspect medieval houses often felt full, not because their owners possessed so much, but because every fragment stayed employed. There is a tenderness in that too. Old things remain close. A mother's worn wool mantle becomes a child's bed curtain. A father's ruined sleeve becomes stuffing along a shutter edge. A rag from some long-forgotten tunic sits under a latch where a hand still touches it every night. The house is warm partly because nothing beloved ever leaves completely. Then there is the doorway, which the source treats with more respect than most modern readers would think to give it. A doorway is a wound in the wall, a necessary one, but a wound all the same. In winter, every opening must justify itself. So doors are made thick when possible, low, heavy, close-fitting if fortune and skill allow. A raised sill, a hanging skin, a cloth behind the plank. Some homes even create a little pause space near the entrance, a rude, tiny buffer. Not a proper hall in the later sense, but enough that the full outside does not stride straight into the center of the room. You can feel the intelligence of that with your whole body. Open. Enter. Close quickly. save the warmth. Even the practice of keeping animals near the house or in attached spaces in some regions belongs partly to this same logic. Modern gnosis object. Medieval winter shrugs. Warmth is warmth. Thick walls, shared with animal bodies, change the thermal mood of a building in ways politeness does not often admit. The source never romanticizes this. It simply understands that survival has broader definitions of acceptable company than comfort catalogs do. And perhaps that is the quietest beauty of all. Insulation in this world was not a single product or a single technique. It was a habit of mind. A refusal to let empty space remain empty if it could be made useful. A refusal to let cloth hang idle if it could block air. A refusal to let moss stay in the field if it could guard a wall. A refusal to let the winter have the last word in any crack small enough for human hands to answer. Night changes the moral weight of winter. During the day there is work, movement. The fire can be fed, the pot stirred, a door opened and closed with purpose. At night the body must surrender. That is what makes sleep in a medieval winter house so intimate and so serious. Once you lie down, you are trusting cloth, straw, timber, embers, and other bodies to keep the cold from claiming too much of you before dawn. The source becomes especially tender here, and I think that tenderness is deserved. A bed in the modern sense is often a private island. In the medieval winter world, it was more often a shared fortification. Straw mattresses, wool blankets, linen sheets if fortune allowed, coarse coverings, skins, bolsters, packed with whatever could be spared. All of these formed less a piece of furniture than a layered defense. The richest among them might have curtained beds, canopies, enclosed box beds, carved frames that held warmth close. The poorest might have pallets and heaps of straw near the hearth. But everywhere the principle was the same. Sleep warm, or do not sleep well at all. I have always found straw mattresses unexpectedly moving. They rustle. They settle. They smell of field even in deep winter, a dry ghost of warmer months trapped beneath the body. Yes, they prick. Yes, they flatten. Yes, they harbor little inconveniences modern people would not greet with grace. But they also lift a sleeper off the murderous pull of earth. That matters. Medieval intelligence again. Raise the body. Add air. Add straw. Add wool. Add another body if possible. And the night becomes more survivable. The source notes that people often slept together for warmth, and that may be one of the most human details in the entire story. Children beside parents. Siblings together. Servants near one another. Sometimes animals close enough to lend heat, whether by intention or by the persuasive selfishness of the animals themselves. A dog at the foot of the bed is not only charming, he is a small furnace with opinions. A cat by the knees is not only decorative, she is tactical softness. Medieval sleeping arrangements often make modern privacy look a little fragile and a little spoiled. If you were standing in such a room just before everyone settled down, you would hear the shift in the house. The louder tasks are over. The last spoon has scraped the pot. A cloak has been checked for dryness. The fire has been banked lower. Not dead. Never willingly dead. but reduced to a red-breathing core under ash. Someone carries a warming pan, if the household has one, between hearth and bed. Metal warmed and then slipped under blankets for a little while, just long enough to blunt the first shock of cold linen. I love that detail because it feels so clever and so full of care. Heat borrowed from the fire, carried like a secret, tucked into the place where the body will soon lie. Then blankets are lifted. The source is very good on blankets. Wool, especially. Wool is one of winter's great moral teachers. It smells of animal and lanolin and weather and old use. It can itch. It can feel heavy. It can also save a life. Layer on layer. Some finer, some rougher, some patched, some inherited, some perhaps once part of another garment. Under the hand, the different textures tell a family history. This blanket from a marriage chest, that one from an older parent, this felted edge repaired 3 times. That corner darned with thread not quite matching because matching is a summer luxury. You know that feeling when you slide under blankets and the cold comes with you at first. The bed is almost accusatory. Sheets chill the skin. Air trapped inside has not yet remembered how to be kind. Then, slowly, almost shyly, warmth gathers back. A knee tucked close. Hands under cloth. Breath rebounding from the enclosure. Another body near enough that its presence changes the whole climate. Medieval sleep depended on that change more than we usually admit. Curtains around the bed made a profound difference where they existed. The source mentions bed curtains and enclosed sleeping boxes, and I am so glad it does. A bed curtain is not only privacy, it is architecture inside architecture. Another room within the room. Another small pocket where warmth can be held against the night. Draw the curtain, and the bed becomes its own climate, thick with breath, fabric, and the smell of sleep. In colder regions, box beds were even more direct, almost cupboards of survival. You climb in, close the door or panel, and the night outside the little wooden chamber becomes less absolute. It is easy to smile at that now. People in drawers. Families folded into tiny wooden compartments. Yet if you imagine the wind pressing at the house outside, the smile becomes respect very quickly. A box bed is not quaint. It is an answer. The source also touches on divided sleep, that old rhythm where people slept, woke, tended the fire, or said prayers, or handled some quiet task, then slept again. Winter houses make that pattern easy to understand. The night was long. Embers needed watching. Bodies woke to shift, to listen, to check a child, to pull another blanket edge higher, to tuck feet against the dog, to judge whether the room had grown colder. Sleep was not always one sealed block. It was another household practice, flexible, interrupted, patient. And the sounds of that room at night are among the loveliest in all domestic history. Straw whispering as someone turns. A dog sighing. A beam giving one low wooden complaint as the temperature changes. A little hiss from the banked coals. The soft thud of wind finding the shutter and being refused. A sleeping child making one half-word sound into the blanket. Nothing dramatic, which is exactly why it feels safe. Safety is often repetitive sound without surprise. I think that is one reason winter sleep tends to gather memory around it. People remember not only cold, but who was near. The grandmother cough across the room. The smell of smoke in the blanket. The way a parent adjusted the cover without quite waking you. The weight of another body at the edge of the bed, proving you were not alone against the dark. Medieval warmth was communal down to the level of dreams. The source mentions herbs in bedding too, and this detail deserves its little glow. Lavender, mugwort, sweet herbs, where available, not enough to turn a bed into a noble fantasy, but enough to interrupt pests, sourness, and the moral triumph of smoke. If one tuft of fragrant plant hidden in straw could make lying down feel less like entering fatigue and more like entering rest, then someone would use it. Medieval people did not reject comfort. They simply pursued it without illusions. There is a darker edge to all this, of course. Not every bed was kind. Illness moved through shared sleeping. Vermin had opinions. Damp could creep in. Frost could still reach the edge of a blanket. The source never denies that. But it keeps bringing us back to the deeper truth. Medieval people built warmth through layering, nearness, and repeated acts of care. Even when the materials were rough, the intention was tender. Honestly, I think the bed may be where that tenderness is easiest to see. A warmed stone wrapped to protect feet. A blanket edge tucked under a sleeping child. A curtain drawn. A dog admitted. Someone choosing the colder side so another can have the warmer one near the wall or the hearth line. The house may be poor. The gesture is rich. At the very coldest hours before dawn, when the fire is mostly hidden and the room feels suspended between sleep and waking, the bed becomes a small republic of breath. Warm air under blankets. Wool holding the shape of bodies. Straw settling. Linen cooling where exposed and warming where pressed. The whole house narrows to this one little state of trust. If the roof holds, if the wall holds, if the shutters hold, if the embers last, then morning can be reached. The source also lets the emotional weight of shared sleep come forward, and I think that is wise, because warmth in bed was never only technical. It was relational. A winter bed teaches hierarchy, yes, but it also teaches mercy. Someone gives up the warm edge. Someone draws the blanket higher for another. Someone wakes enough to check the coals, then lies back down carefully, so the mattress does not lose too much of the warmth already gathered in it. Such acts are small, almost invisible, and yet they are the entire fabric of survival. I have always liked the image of a bed curtain moving slightly when someone settles behind it. Not much, just a faint sway in low light. The room beyond remains smoky and dark. The little enclosed sleeping space grows its own breath, its own smell of wool and skin and straw, its own protected silence. There is something almost womb-like in that, though medieval people would never have phrased it so grandly. They would simply have known that once the curtain was drawn, the cold lost some of its confidence. And there were little tricks everywhere. A spare cloak spread over the feet. A cap kept on in bed because heat leaves the head with scandalous eagerness. Hands tucked between knees. A hot brick or stone wrapped carefully and pushed toward the coldest corner of the blankets. Children laid between adults when the weather turned especially severe. These are the details I trust most in the source, because they feel exactly like what people do whenever winter becomes serious enough to humble pride. You know that feeling when the bed is still cold, but you can sense it beginning to change around you. The first tiny pocket of warmth at the chest, then another at the knees. Then the blanket above stops feeling like a sheet of chill air and begins feeling heavy in a protective way. Medieval nights must have taught people patience at that scale. Wait. Hold still. Let the bed learn your shape. Let warmth spread slowly. Not all mercies arrive quickly. Sometimes the best comfort may have been simple listening. Rain turned to sleet outside, but not coming through. Snow sliding from the roof rather than sinking it. A shutter holding. The dog still breathing near the feet. Another sleeper turning and settling. Proof of shared life close at hand. Even fear sounds different under blankets. More distant. Less authoritative. So when the source says the bed was fortress, intimacy, and emotional shelter all at once, I think it touches the deepest truth of the matter. A medieval winter bed was not soft in the modern pampered sense. It could still be holy in the older human sense, a place where frailty was admitted, protected, and carried through the longest hours of darkness with help. And that brings us almost naturally to the final wider economy of warmth, because beds and blankets and shared bodies did not stay warm by magic. They depended on fuel, on wood, peat, dung, charcoal, labor, forests, its stores, and the long discipline of not burning today what must also protect tomorrow. The next movement widens from the bed back into the village and the winter landscape beyond it, where every warm room begins in cold labor under the open sky. By the time the blankets have warmed and the bed has become a little republic of breath, the mind begins to understand a harder truth. None of that warmth was free. Every glowing coal, every bowl of pottage, every dry plank near the hearth, every softened blanket edge, all of it began far outside the house, in labor performed under a sky that gave nothing away kindly. The source turns outward here, toward fuel, food, smell, and sound. And once it does, the whole winter house begins to feel like part of a larger living system. Warmth was never only a domestic feeling. It was a seasonal economy. Firewood was wealth in one of the oldest and plainest senses. Not decorative wealth. Not coin. Not silver. Not even grain, though grain mattered greatly. Firewood was winter translated into stacks. If you saw a careful pile of split timber against a wall in late autumn, you were looking at stored chances. Chances to wake to warmth. Chances to boil water. Chances to dry, damp cloaks. Chances to keep the old and the young from falling too deep into the cold. The source understands that wood in winter is not background. It is fate made visible. Imagine the work of gathering it. A man in the frozen woods, or a woman, or anyone strong enough and available enough, because winter rarely respects tidy divisions. The axe bites. The sound travels sharply through bare branches. White breath leaves the mouth in quick bursts. Fingers go numb, then ache back toward life when the body moves harder. Wood splits reluctantly in the cold. each piece opening with a sound half crack and half complaint. Then the carrying. Back bowed, arms full, sled dragged. A child trailing behind with smaller sticks, because no task is too small when the house is counting on flame. I have always thought wood piles are among the most touching objects in human history. They look so ordinary until you realize how many mornings and nights are folded inside them. Each log is future heat, waiting for permission. Each branch knows the room it has not yet entered. There is something deeply reassuring about a woodpile tall enough to look slightly arrogant. It says, in a language older than money, that the house may have a chance. Not every region could rely on good wood. The source is careful to widen the picture. Peat mattered, especially where forests were poor and marshland more generous. There is a particular sadness to peat cutting that I find strangely beautiful. Dark blocks lifted from wet ground, laid out to dry under an uncertain sky, then stacked and stored until winter comes calling. Peat smoke smells different from wood smoke. Denser, earthier, more like ancient ground remembering fire. The whole room would take on that note. A marsh ghost living beside the bread and broth. Charcoal had its place too, especially in certain crafts and richer settings. Dung fuel as well, dried and saved because necessity has wider standards of dignity than luxury ever learns. If the animal eats your straw and later helps warm your house, medieval winter considers that a fair and even elegant arrangement. The source never mocks such fuel choices, and I am grateful for that. Survival deserves respect even when it smells less noble than oak. And then there is the great art of rationing. A family with sense did not burn through its future merely because one evening felt cruel. The fire had to be watched morally as well as physically. Too much fuel now could mean fear in February. Too little now could mean sickness by dawn. So people learned the character of flame with the intimacy of shepherds reading weather. A thick log for lasting heat. Brushwood for quick waking flame. Peat for slow endurance. Dung cakes when wood must be spared. Charcoal where clean, hot burn was needed. Embers banked at night under ash like a treasure hidden in plain sight. The source says people sometimes measured winter in fire days, and whether or not every household would have phrased it so neatly, the feeling is absolutely right. You do not merely own fuel. You watch it diminish into time. One stack shorter, one basket lighter, one corner of the shed more empty than yesterday. The house notices. Everyone notices. That knowledge gives food a different atmosphere too. A medieval winter meal is not only nourishment, it is fuel converted into tenderness. Consider the cauldron, blackened, hanging or standing near the hearth. A pot that receives water, grain, scraps, roots, cabbage, onion, leeks, beans, when fortune allows. Perhaps bacon, perhaps a bone, returning one last gift after better days. It simmers not for minutes, but for hours. The source lingers on pottage, and rightly so. Pottage is less a dish than a way of keeping hunger from making enemies of the living. If you stand beside that pot and inhale slowly, the room changes around you. Steam rises, carrying onion sweetness, cabbage heaviness, the warm animal note of broth, if any, was earned. The earth smell of turnips or parsnips, the comforting thickness of grain surrendering itself into softness. A pot on the fire tells the body that time is being converted into food. That may be one of the most reassuring smells ever invented. Bread belongs here too. Dough risen or not, coarse or fine, rye, barley, oats, maslin, whatever the region and the purse have managed to provide. The source mentions communal ovens, and I always love that detail because it reminds us that a warm house is never purely private. Villages shared heat in practical ways. One oven serving many families. One bake day filling the lanes with the smell of crust and smoke. Warm loaves carried home wrapped in cloth, pressed close like small edible suns. Allée warmed by the hearth, mulled when possible with herbs or spice in richer households, becomes another form of internal winter architecture. A cup held in both hands. Steam touching the face. Throat warming slowly. Not drunken comfort necessarily, though history certainly made room for that too. But the simple civilizing act of hot liquid moving through a chilled body. The source is wise to treat such moments as part of domestic coziness rather than indulgence. Warmth taken into the body matters as much as warmth around it. And smell, always smell, keeps returning as one of the house's great teachers. Medieval homes breathe through scent. Smoke in wool, wax from candles, tallow from lamps, drying herbs, stew, damp leather, wet dog, rushes, old timber, sometimes rosemary, juniper, mint, lavender, meadowsweet, depending on region, season, and luck. The room tells its story through the nose before the mind has time to become literary about it. You know that feeling when a house seems alive because it has a stable smell. Not clean exactly. Not dirty exactly. Simply itself. Medieval winter homes had that identity in abundance. A room sealed against wind becomes intimate partly because it keeps its own atmosphere. The source captures this beautifully. To enter such a house was to be received by a climate with personality. Windows change that climate with light, but also with what they exclude. A horn pane glows dull gold in the morning. A shuttered slit holds the dark in place after sunset. Candle wax adds its own sweetness. Tallow adds another, less admired, but no less historical. Even the act of trimming a wick, pinching a wick, shielding a flame from draft, all of it belongs to the same economy as wood cutting and pottage stirring. Warmth and light are sisters in winter. You tend both with the same attention. Then night comes fully, and the house begins making its private music. This may be my favorite part of the source's wider winter world. The house as soundscape. Beams creak as temperatures change. Thatch settles. Wind tries the shutter again. A pot lid gives a small metal note as trapped heat shifts it. A mouse makes its scandalous little progress somewhere behind a chest. Ash sighs inward. A dog turns once and settles. Someone coughs in another bed. Perhaps a church bell reaches faintly through the frost from farther off, smaller in the air than it sounds by day. None of these sounds is grand. Yet together they create one of the most powerful forms of comfort. Continuity without surprise. The house is noisy in a loyal way. Every sound says the structure still stands. The fire still breathes. The sleepers still sleep. Fear prefers silence interrupted. Comfort prefers low repetition. The source also suggests that cooking and fuel rhythms shaped time itself. I believe that. Morning begins with coaxing flame and perhaps heating whatever remains from yesterday. Midday tastes of work interrupted for warmth. Evening belongs to the pot again, to slower food, to longer smoke, to the room drawing tighter around its own glow. A winter day becomes legible through the progress of fire. And this is where the wider emotional truth of fuel reveals itself. Wood is not only material, it is permission. Permission to stay in one room. Permission to linger over broth. Permission to dry stockings and mittens and cloaks. Permission to tell one more story before bed. Permission for a child to sleep without waking blue-lipped in terror. Every stick burned is a small transaction between labor and mercy. Honestly, I think this may be why historical winter homes feel so moving to modern readers once they are seen clearly. We still understand, somewhere beneath convenience, that warmth is sacred when it costs work. Even now, a mug of hot soup on a cold night feels older than civilization. A glowing kitchen at dusk still feels morally right in a way difficult to explain. Medieval people lived much closer to that truth than we do. They knew the cost of every comfort with alarming accuracy. So listen now to the house with all of that in mind. The wood stack outside waiting its turn. Peat blocks dark by the wall. Steam rising from the pot. Bread cooling under cloth. A little herb sweetness fighting a losing but honorable battle against smoke. Candlelight trembling at the edge of a horn pane. The old building speaking in low creaks while everyone inside measures the season not by calendar alone, but by what remains in the shed, in the basket, in the ash, in the pot. This is the winter ecosystem of warmth. No single object can claim credit. The bed needs the fire. The fire needs the wood. The wood needs the labor. The labor needs the food. The food needs the pot. The pot needs the room. The room needs the wall. The wall needs the moss. Everything leans on everything else. And once you understand that, the final step comes almost naturally. Beyond fuel and food and sound waits belief. Small rituals. Herbs hung not only for scent, but luck. Charms by the door. Midwinter customs. Shared embers carried between homes. Regional variations. Monastery, quiet. Castle, cold. Longhouse, smoke. The first melt of spring. The last movement of the story must gather all of that and let the winter house become not only a physical shelter, but a symbol of how people held one another through the darkest season. By the time we reach the end of winter, the medieval house has become more than timber and daub and stored fuel. It has become a little moral world, a place where warmth is earned, guarded, shared, prayed over, and remembered. The source turns here toward belief, ritual, regional difference, and the slow arrival of spring. And I think that is exactly right, because no one survives a long winter by matter alone. The mind must be warmed too. People in the medieval world understood that with perfect seriousness. A branch of juniper smoldering near the threshold. A little bread set in a particular place. Salt used not only to season, but to protect. A whispered blessing over the embers. A saint appealed to in weather that had forgotten mercy. Goose fat rubbed into skin and perhaps into faith itself by repetition. Herbs hung near the bed, not because they could change the season, but because they could change how a room felt while the season raged on. The source is gentle with these customs, and I am glad. They are easy for modern cleverness to mock. Yet once you have spent enough time in a freezing village, mockery looks like a luxury of the overly heated. I have always found protective rituals in winter homes deeply moving. They reveal that warmth is never entirely physical. A room can be heated and still feel exposed. A charm on the lintel, a little cross in ash, a blessing over broth. These acts tell the body that the house is defended on more than one front. The wall holds the wind. The prayer holds the dark. A family needs both. And those defenses varied by region, which gives the whole story its wider human beauty. In Scandinavia, longhouses and turf roofs held warmth low under smoke-dark rafters, while the outer cold lay white and immense beyond the walls. In the colder eastern lands, great masonry stoves and heated platforms could turn one room into a pocket of almost shocking comfort, while the yard outside froze hard enough to ring under a boot. In alpine farmhouses, animals below and people above shared more than a building. They shared thermal strategy with very little shame about the arrangement. Monasteries had their own rhythms, colder in some places than outsiders imagine, but rich in routine. Thick cloaks, communal prayers, and the quiet discipline of heat preserved through order. Castles, for all their banners and stone authority, often remained drafty monsters in winter, teaching their noble inhabitants that prestige does not seal a window any better than wood unless someone takes care of the gap. That may be one of my favorite quiet jokes in the whole medieval world. A peasant cottage can feel warmer than a grand hall if one is built for survival and the other for display. Stone impresses the eye. It does not always flatter the feet. The source wisely reminds us that clothing belonged to the house just as much as walls did. Wool upon wool. Linen beneath if fortune allowed. Fur where possible. Hoods. Caps. Layer over layer. Because the body itself had to become a little house. Even bedclothes followed the same logic. Wrapped stones. Heated pans. Cloaks doubled as blankets. Blankets doubled as curtains. Curtains doubled as wall barriers when needed. The medieval instinct was never to let a useful thing be only one useful thing. And midwinter customs added another kind of insulation. The Yule log. Feast days. Shared song. Ale passed in a brighter room than usual. Candles appearing in greater number than thrift would normally allow. Visits between houses. Embers carried carefully from one hearth to another. This last image stays with me more than almost anything else. A coal moved in a covered pan through snow-dark air from one home to the next. Warmth shared as substance. Community made literal. You know that feeling when a neighborhood glows a little differently on a festival night? and even the cold seems willing to wait at the edge of the light. Medieval winters must have been full of that feeling in precious little doses. Not enough to erase hunger or fear. Enough to remind people they were not enduring separately. The source treats these moments not as decoration, but as emotional fuel. I think that is exactly right. A winter feast is not merely indulgence. It is resistance to despair. There were songs, too. The low kind sung near a fire when the room is already warm enough that voices no longer shake from cold. Stories, saints, ghosts, animal tales, family memory, the same sounds repeated year after year until they became part of the season itself. A child learns winter partly through the ear. The same bell on the feast day. The same hymn. The same old uncle telling the same dramatic story about a storm 10 winters ago, improving it a little every year, which is only fair. Memory needs seasoning, too. The source also understands that winter ends slowly. No door opens and announces salvation. First, there is melt. A little drip from the eaves. A patch of darker ground by the threshold. The roof shedding its burden with more confidence. The lane turning ugly with mud, which no one praises exactly, but everyone respects as evidence. Water means change. Water means the house will soon face a different set of arguments. Imagine that first late winter morning when the cold is still real, yet something has softened. The shutter opens to a brighter light. The smell outside is not floral exactly, but looser. Wet earth beneath frozen crust. A stream running louder. Straw less stiff underfoot. Smoke rising, not straight upward in cruel stillness, but moving with air that has remembered how to carry scent again. Inside the house, the fire still burns, but it no longer feels like a besieged fortress. It feels like an old companion whose hardest labor may be ending. Then repairs begin in earnest. Roof thatch inspected. Soot scraped where it can be. Wall patches renewed. Rushes changed. Bedding aired. The source is wonderful on this transition because it does not let spring cancel winter. The house bears the record of what it survived. Smoke on beams. Frayed blanket edges. A thinner woodpile. Cracks sealed and resealed. Yet these are not only marks of hardship. They are proofs of continuity. Honestly, I think that may be the final comfort of the medieval winter house. It teaches that warmth is never abstract. It is made by people who remain attentive long enough to keep making it. The same hand that stuffed moss into a wall crack tucked a child into bed. The same person who split peat stirred the pot. The same room that smelled of smoke in January smelled of damp thaw in March. Time passes through the house and leaves its record in every surface. There is one more emotional truth in the source that deserves to be held gently at the end. Medieval people did not survive winter through comfort, as we define comfort now. They survived through community, repetition, labor, and the sacred feeling attached to small, reliable mercies. A warm bowl. A live ember. A roof that holds. A dog at the foot of the bed. A shutter tight against the wind. Another voice in the room. These are not luxurious things. They are the original luxuries, the kind the body understands before language becomes grand about them. That is why the story circles back so beautifully to us. Modern people still love soft blankets, soup in a steaming bowl, candlelight against early darkness, the smell of bread, the sound of rain or wind heard from inside a safe room, because the body has never forgotten what these things once meant. Medieval winter simply makes the meaning sharper. The house is not cozy because a magazine has arranged it attractively. It is cozy because it stands between life and cold and does not fail. So let the last image be quiet. A cottage at the edge of spring, snow shrinking into gray water by the lane, smoke lifting from the roof in a softer air, the door opening, a bucket carried out, a blanket shaken, a dog blinking in the light. Inside, the hearth smaller now, but still alive. The beams above wearing their soot-like memory. The wall patched once more. The floor newly strewn. The room still holding the shape of winter, even as the season releases it. Before we leave entirely, let the house hold one more evening. The season has turned enough that the air outside is damp rather than cruel. Yet habit still draws everyone near the fire after dark. That is another thing winter leaves behind. Even when the worst has passed, bodies remember the old pattern. A stool goes back to the same place. Hands lift to the same warmth. Someone glances toward the shutter edge, though the draft is less fierce now. You can feel memory moving through the room like another kind of smoke. Slower, kinder, persistent. The source hints at this afterlife of winter, and I think it is one of the loveliest parts. A hard season teaches a household its own shape. Who rises first to wake the coals? Who notices the weak patch in the roof? Who turns a loaf at the right moment? Who comforts a child when wind sounds too much like trouble? Who pretends not to be tired? Who keeps the stories? By spring, the house has not merely kept people warm. It has revealed them to one another. And there is cleaning, too, which sounds less poetic than it is. Ash carried out. Rushes replaced. Bedding aired. Walls checked. Soot brushed where possible. A winter room slowly unclenching. The very smell changes day by day. Less dense smoke. More damp earth from outside. More open air through the door. Perhaps the first green scent from something crushed under a boot in the yard. Medieval people must have felt that shift bodily long before they ever described it. The house did not simply become warmer. It became wider. Still, some customs would remain. A blessed twig over the lintel. A charm tucked near the bed. A habit of banking coals carefully, even when the nights were no longer murderous. The mind does not surrender protective rituals as quickly as the snow surrenders the field. Nor should it. Winter leaves respect behind. Respect for roof. Respect for fuel. Respect for the sound of another sleeper in the dark. Respect for the simple miracle that a room can keep weather out long enough for tenderness to survive inside it. So when we say medieval people built warm homes, we should hear the full weight of the phrase. They did not simply pile material into walls. They built systems of mercy. Thermal mercy. Social mercy. Spiritual mercy. A bench near the fire. A shared loaf, a drawn curtain, a hidden ember, a low song, A hand checking a blanket edge in the night. Those are architectural details too, just not the kind drawn on plans. I think that is what lingers most after a story like this. Not misery, not hardship alone. The extraordinary tenderness of all the little acts by which human beings make shelter feel like more than shelter. A handful of moss, a hung cloth, a bed curtain, a loaf cooling, a child carried near the coals, a prayer murmured over a weather-stained threshold. Warmth, in the deepest historical sense, is simply care made visible. And perhaps that is why the medieval house remains so moving. It knows something modern abundance often tries to forget. Comfort is sacred when it is shared. Light is beautiful when darkness is near enough to measure it. A roof matters most when weather is real. Fire matters most when fuel costs labor. Home matters most when the world outside has not agreed to be kind. So let the winter go now. Let the meltwater run. Let the shutters stand open a little longer each day. Let the herbs dry in clearer air. Let the last heavy blankets be folded back. Let the soot stay on the beams as proof. And let the old house settle into spring with the quiet dignity of something that has once again carried living bodies through the hardest season, not by magic, but by skill, stubbornness, memory, and love. Good night.